The Battle of the Bulge, fought from December 16, 1944, to January 25, 1945, was a major German offensive during World War II that aimed to split the Allied forces and capture the strategically significant city of Antwerp. Launched in the rugged Ardennes region, the surprise attack initially caught American troops off guard, leading to significant territorial gains by the German forces. Despite being outnumbered, U.S. troops, including the 101st Airborne Division, mounted fierce resistance, famously responding to surrender demands with defiance. The battle became one of the most significant confrontations for the U.S. Army, with heavy casualties on both sides. The Germans suffered approximately 120,000 losses while the Allies experienced 8,000 killed and 48,000 wounded. The German push ultimately failed to achieve its objectives, leading to a depletion of their strategic reserves and hastening the war's conclusion in favor of the Allies. The legacy of the battle is marked by both its immediate impact on the war effort and the resilience displayed by the soldiers involved, including the participation of African American troops. So, we try to know about how to start Battle of Bulge. In December 1944, 6 months after the successful landing at Normandy, Allied forces were closing in on Germany's western frontier. The advance across France was so rapid as to overstretch the Allied supply lines that ran 500 miles back to Normandy and the English Channel. Faced with growing fuel shortages, the Supreme Allied Commander, General of the Army Dwight D. Eisenhower, gave fuel supply priority to the advancing British forces under Field Marshal Sir Bernard Law Montgomery, as they drove toward the Low Countries and the port city of Antwerp. The U.S. advance farther south ground to a halt as a result of the lack of fuel. As the Allied assault on Germany stalled, Adolf Hitler saw a chance to alter the course of the war by launching a great counteroffensive against the Western Allies. He announced his intentions on September 16 at a conference held at his East Prussian headquarters, the Wolf's Lair. Hitler's plan was bold and desperate. It called for an attack against the rugged Ardennes sector, thinly held by U.S. forces. Hoping for a repeat of the highly successful 1940 campaign that led to the fall of France, Hitler aimed at splitting the Allied forces, U.S. troops to the south and the British and Canadians to the north. The German thrust first would obtain the Meuse River and then advance on the strategically important city of Antwerp. Speed and the ability of the advancing German forces to capture key road junctions in the Ardennes were critical ingredients for success. Once this was achieved, the Allied forces, chiefly British and Canadian, north of a line running from Antwerp to the Ardennes, would be destroyed. Hitler hoped that, if the plan worked, the Allied coalition would fall apart, leading to a negotiated peace. It might at least be possible to transfer troops to the Eastern Front to meet the Russian threat. Hitler's generals were less confident of success because his all plans was failed. They argued that Germany did not have sufficient resources and troops and material to carry out such an attack. Nevertheless, by tremendous exertion, 2 new panzer armies, the 6th SS Panzer and 5th Panzer, were assembled. More than 25 German divisions were gathered for the attack along a 50-mile front opposite 5 U.S. divisions. 2 largely infantry armies, the 15th and 7th, were to provide support on the right and left flanks, respectively, of advancing panzer armies. 200,000 troops were mustered, along with 600 tanks and 1,900 guns. Opposite, the U.S. front was held by 80,000 troops, supported by 400 tanks and 400 guns. Special commando units composed of English-speaking Germans dressed in U.S. uniforms were assembled to spread chaos behind the U.S. lines. As the Germans marshaled their forces for the attack, strict secrecy was imposed on all involved. Poor weather and the rugged territory of the Eifel region opposite the U.S. sector covered German preparations. Radio traffic directly mentioning the impending counteroffensive was banned. Although the Allies had various clues that something was being planned, underestimation of German potential led Allied intelligence to disregard the accumulating evidence of a possible enemy winter offensive. Allied intelligence considered the broken terrain of the Ardennes region unsuitable, and therefore unlikely to be attacked. Intercepted German radio traffic that mentioned fuel shortages was interpreted as a positive indicator that the Germans were incapable of launching an attack. In reality, fuel was being prioritized for the assembled German forces in the Eifel. On the morning of December 16, advancing out of the winter gloom, the German forces under General Gerd von Rundstedt obtained complete tactical surprise as the Great Offensive began. 2 U.S. divisions, depleted by earlier fighting, were shattered by the initial blow. Rapid gains were made by the attacking Germans, as they drove on the key road junctions at St. Vith and Bastogne. The German advance, however, immediately ran into difficulty. Even cut off and surrounded U.S. units continued to fight with a ferocity unanticipated by the Germans. If the Allies underestimated the German ability to launch a great counteroffensive, Hitler also seriously erred by underestimating the fighting abilities of the U.S. troops. For 6 days, U.S. troops at St. Vith held the critical road junction against German attacks. The 101st Airborne Division encircled at Bastogne held on in the face of tremendous pressure from the 5th Panzer Army. The commander of the division responded to a surrender demand from the Germans with the famous reply, "Nuts!" To the north, the 82nd Airborne Division held on to the shoulder of the Bulge. The Germans were unable to widen their initial breach in the Allied line. In the most infamous moment of the battle, on December 17, elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division participated in the murder of 86 U.S. prisoners at Malmedy. A number of the German officers and men involved were later charged with war crimes. The German attack was canalized and proved unable to widen the initial breakthrough that had managed to create only a bulge in the Allied line, from which the famous battle receives its name. The Allied response to the German attack was swift. Eisenhower halted all offensive operations along the front and concentrated all available Allied forces to stop the German advance. With communications sliced, Lieutenant General Omar N. Bradley's troops north of the salient were put under the command of Field Marshal Montgomery. In a remarkable feat, Lieutenant General George S. Patton's Third Army halted the Germans' advance into the Saar and, after a 90-degree turn north, moved to relieve Bastogne. By Christmas Day, staunch U.S. resistance and critical fuel shortages had stopped the German momentum more than 5 miles short of the Meuse River, the first objective of Hitler's battle plan, and 100 miles from the primary objective of Antwerp. A long but narrow bulge had been created in the Allied lines that was 40 miles at the base and nearly 60 miles in depth. The clearing of the skies over the battlefield opened the way for massive Allied air attacks on the German forces. More than 5,000 planes moved to cut off the German supply line and support the hard-pressed Allied ground forces. Not until late January 1945 did the Allies manage to retake the lost ground. Sadly, significances of this battle. Very big losses. The Battle of the Bulge, perhaps the greatest battle in the history of the U.S. Army, took staggering tolls. The Germans lost 120,000 men either killed, wounded, or missing, along with 600 tanks and assault guns. Airstrikes to cover the retreating German forces had cost the Luftwaffe, the German Air Force, more than 1,500 aircraft. Allied casualties, chiefly from the United States, totaled 8,000 killed and 48,000 wounded, many of whom suffered from a new battlefield scourge in the form of frostbite, which sometimes necessitated amputation and almost always required lengthy convalescence. In addition, 21,000 Allied soldiers were captured or missing. Nearly 740 tanks and tank destroyers were lost. Among the soldiers, 4,500 African Americans saw action. Hitler's great gamble had failed without achieving any of its objectives. The Germans, using up their strategic reserves, lost irreplaceable men and equipment that hastened the end of the war. At most, the Germans had merely slowed the Allied advance by weeks. With the destruction of Germany's reserves, little was left to stop the Russian New Year offensive on the Eastern Front and the Allied advance across the Rhine into the heart of Germany. The Battle of the Bulge, December 16, 1944 to January 25, 1945, was the largest and bloodiest single battle fought by the United States in World War II. Its significance extends far beyond the battlefield, serving as the strategic death gasp of the Third Reich that reshaped the war's timeline on both the Western and Eastern fronts. 1. The end of German offensive capability. The most immediate military significance was the permanent destruction of Germany's strategic reserves. The gamble. Hitler stripped the Eastern Front of his best remaining panzer divisions for a Hail Mary offensive in the West, aiming to capture the port of Antwerp and force a negotiated peace. The result: the offensive failed, costing Germany over 100,000 casualties and, more critically, hundreds of tanks and aircraft that could not be replaced. After the Bulge, the German army was incapable of mounting another large-scale offensive, reducing their remaining strategy to a slow, desperate retreat. 2. A hidden victory for the Soviet Union. While fought in Belgium, the battle had a profound impact. Weakened east. By moving elite armored units to the Ardennes, Hitler left the Eastern Front dangerously thin. The Vistula-Oder offensive, in January 1945, exploiting this weakness, the Soviets launched a massive offensive earlier than planned, partly to relieve pressure on the West. They crushed the depleted German lines and advanced from Poland to the gates of Berlin, the Oder River, in mere weeks. The Bulge inadvertently accelerated the Soviet conquest of eastern Germany. 3. The ultimate test of the Allied alliance. The battle severely strained the political and military partnership between the US and UK, nearly causing a rupture in command. The command crisis. In the chaos of the initial German breakthrough, General Eisenhower transferred command of two American armies, the 1st and 9th, to the British Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. The controversy: Montgomery later held a press conference that was perceived as him claiming to have rescued the incompetence of American leadership. This infuriated U.S. Generals Bradley and Patton, who threatened to resign. Eisenhower had to personally intervene, and Winston Churchill eventually gave a speech to Parliament explicitly praising American troops to repair the diplomatic damage. 4. The triumph of air power and logistics. The battle demonstrated the overwhelming material superiority of the Allies. Weather dependency. The German attack relied entirely on bad weather to ground Allied planes. The skies clear. When the weather cleared around December 23, Allied air power, 70,000 plus sorties, decimated German supply lines. They destroyed over 11,000 German vehicles, causing the German tanks to literally run out of fuel and be abandoned. It proved that German tactical skill could no longer overcome Allied industrial dominance. Historical weight for the U.S. Army. For the United States, this remains a defining moment of military heritage. Scale: it involved over 600,000 U.S. troops, more than the population of many U.S. cities at the time. Casualties: with 89,000 plus American casualties, including 19,000 killed, it remains the bloodiest battle in U.S. Army history. Symbolism: the defensive bastion by the 101st Airborne, surrounded and outgunned, became legendary, particularly General McAuliffe's one-word official response to a German surrender demand: nuts. If you enjoy our story of history, please give your love and support.